Okay, today's gonna be a little different. A lot of decisions, halachic decisions, depend on data, information, numbers, and of course, part of that. And so part of the making that decision is not only getting the halacha straight, but you got to get your information straight first before you get to the halacha. Okay, so. Today I'm going to tell you about, I have 10 examples, but we'll see how many I get to, time permitting, how many I get to, of things where the numbers said a specific thing. The numbers told us one thing, but when you dig a little deeper, you find that maybe it wasn't exactly, something wasn't right about that. Okay, I have 5 different groups of examples of how numbers could be not correct. Okay, so the first is where the information that you have is something's wrong with the numbers. This is like the simplest. Something's wrong with the numbers, or the numbers outdated. Okay, and that has to do like this. In the 1990s, hashkachas became aware that there was this thing going on, that there was surgery being done to cows that would to get rid of a condition called displaced abomasum. They call it DA for short. And there was a lot of people who held that doing that surgery would make the animal into a treifa. Okay, in which case, if the animal is a treifa, then the milk that comes out of the animal is also a treifa. It's also not kosher. Okay, so today had nothing to do with whether that's true or not, whether it's a treifa or not. But one of the questions was how common is this surgery? How common is this surgery to happen on dairy cows? I mean, cows that are giving milk. How common is it really to happen? And everybody knew that it was between 5 and 15% of the cows had the surgery, of dairy cows had the surgery. Okay, that was everybody. That was the working assumption, was that. Okay, and everybody took that as fact for 30 years. Okay, until there's a person named Romanus Blumenfrucht who started learning the sugya. He wrote a sefer called Chalav Treifa. Most of the sefer is on the main question, which is, does the surgery make the animal into a treifa? It's a hilchos treifa sefer, really very well done. That's most of the sefer. But the end of the sefer talks about these numbers. Is how common is it that the animals are really a treifa, which plays into the din afterwards. Okay, so when he dug into it, he found that everybody who was saying that it was between 5 and 15%, it all came from a study by a professor in Cornell University. And this professor, how did he decide how much it was? It was convenient for him. He did a sampling, he said, of 26 farms near Cornell University. Okay, and for perspective, at that time in New York there were 10,000 dairy farms. Okay, so his sampling that he did.
United States or New York?
What'd he say?
United States.
In New York State. New York
Did
State.
you say 10,000?
That's what he said. 10,000.
Okay, that sounds like an interesting number.
My family had dairy farms in New England.
Okay, so maybe I got here. I'm talking about numbers being incorrect, and maybe I have my number. That's how I remember. I might be wrong.
A lot of dairy farms.
I might be wrong, but the point was, the sampling was nothing. The person just went asked a bunch of farmers in his neighborhood what it was, and then so the number itself the number didn't represent at all anything to do with what was really a statistic for every place. But then, okay, that was one thing. But then, when this person, Rabbi Blumenfrucht, was looking into it more, he found out that what was true in 1990 was no longer true, I don't know, in 2020, or whenever he wrote his sefer. Okay? He said it used to be that farmers, when cows had this issue of displaced abomasum, they would do surgery. That was the common thing to do then. But he found out that actually farmers, instead of doing surgery, switched to doing things to prevent the DA cows in the first place. So that the vets told him, I used to do it 30 times a month. Now I do it once a month. I do the surgery. And the farmers changed how they dealt with this kind of an issue. Okay, so while whatever was going on in 1990 things were very different. So the data from back then was not the data. You can't make the decision today based on data from them when things changed. Another thing is that there was this theory going around that if 1% of the cows have the surgery every year, that means is in the second year of the farm, we're going to have 2% of the cows are going to have it, because the 1% from last year, 1% from this year. And then by the third year, we'll have 3%, and the cows last this many longs. So they came up with a cheshbon that it would build up. Okay, it would keep building up. So if 1% of the cows each year, eventually we'd have lots of cows. Cows don't give milk just for 1 year; they give for many years. It would build up. Okay, But it turns out that's actually not true. Romanus found out that it's actually not true. That was people's guess that that's what would happen. But the truth is that cows with DA end up have all kinds of other health issues. And therefore, when they have to get rid of cows every year, when they what they call cull the farm, they get rid of some of the cows. Those are the first ones to go. Okay, so cows. It's true that there are cows that have this issue, and then they deal the surgery to them, but then they get rid of them. Okay, they don't keep them around, so they don't build up anymore. Okay, so the overall, the short version is that what we've seen from this is that everybody was making their decision based on a group of numbers. The numbers might not have been ever accurate in the first place, and even if they were accurate, they might not have been true anymore. And even if they're still true, then there was this extrapolation that if it's 1% 1 year, then it's 4% if the 4 years. That ended up not being so true. Okay. Now the next two I'm going to tell you about. Each one is going to be different from the next. Almost everyone is different from the one before it. Have to do with seeing a big picture. Okay, and the first thing we're going to talk about is pasta from Italy. Okay, so there's an assumption that the wheat that you use to make pasta is called durum wheat. Okay, certain kind of wheat that you do that for, that you make for making pasta. When it's planted in Canada and in the United States, it's planted in the springtime, and the assumption is that flower is there for Chodesh until the next Pesach. So in the summertime, that wheat gets harvested, and that means until the next Pesach, the pasta made with that flour is going to be Chodesh. But there's an assumption that in certain European countries, for our purposes, important is Italy, Russia, and Turkey, they plant their durum wheat as a winter crop, and therefore that wheat is always going to be Yashan. Okay, whether that's true, that from Italy, Russia, and Turkey, it's actually always a winter crop, is up in the air. I don't want to say it's up in the air. I don't know enough to answer that question whether that's true or not. We're going to take that as a fact that that's true, and we'll believe them for now that that's correct. Okay, so Hashkacha, only a few weeks ago, announced that a reputable Hashkacha, that all, at least for this year, all pasta being made in Italy is Yashan for the whole season. Okay, all the way till Pesach, all the pasta is going to be Yashan. All the pasta being made in Italy is going to be Yashan. And they said, because look, they said, I don't know if this is going to work out. I'll do it this way. They said that in 2022, Italy was only getting about 40 million kilo of durum wheat from Russia, but in 2023 that went up tremendously. Okay, they got up almost 500,000 kilo, only 500 million kilo. Okay, it went up almost like 10 times as much. They went from 40 million kilo to 444.
Where does Ukraine pay? Because a lot of the wheat in the Russian Empire came from the Ukraine.
Yes, but this is not coming from Ukraine. This is talking about from Russia itself. And the war plays a role into all this. Has to do with sanctions and all kinds of stuff. Why this playing a role to this? So they said, it went up so tremendously. Now they're getting their wheat, aside from their local grown wheat, which the assumption is that it's always Yashan. There's so much more wheat coming from Russia. It's now mamish. It's 14% of the imports are coming from Russia, plus all their own local grown wheat. So all the wheat all the pasta they're going to make is going to be Yashan. Okay. Then they added another thing. They said, it takes 10 weeks for things to be shipped from Italy all the way to the United States. So by the time it gets to the United States, even if there would be a problem, by the time it would get here, it would already also be passed after Pesach. Okay, it takes so long for it to show up to get from there to here that it'll also be Yashan for that reason. Okay. So the numbers that I told you, most of the numbers that I told you are true. Okay, but the conclusion that they made from that, I didn't think is accurate. They're still working on how to work on the details of that. Okay, and that's like this. It's true that Russia went from making about 40 million kilo, exporting to Italy about 40 million kilo to about 445 million kilo. Okay, that's true. It's true, but guess what? Between the year 2022 and 2023, the amount of total imports of durum wheat into Italy went up by 65%. Okay, so it's true they got a lot more durum wheat from Russia, but the total amount that they imported went up from 1.9 billion kilo to 3.1 billion kilo. Okay, so it went up a tremendous amount. And guess what else? Who is their main person over here? You see, in the year 2023, Russia was their second biggest country they imported from. Who was the first biggest? It was Canada. Okay, they get their most durum wheat from Canada, and guess what? They didn't sit still of the amount they were getting from Canada. They went up from 608 million kilo to almost 900 million kilo. Okay, they went up almost 50% from Canada. So it's true that they get way more. They were getting way more from Russia. It's true of what we're assuming is going to be Chodesh wheat. But they got way more from their Yashin, from their Chodesh suppliers also. Okay. Okay. Now the truth is things shifted a lot. This is just the first top 10 people who.
From Canada to Italy.
I'm getting to that in 1 second. I'll get to that in 1 second. I get that. But the first assumption that they put that as a sniff. But the first assumption was that there's so much more from Russia that of course it's all Russian. It doesn't turn out that it's not so accurate. Okay, Canada and the United States is still supplying a nice amount of it. About a third of their wheat is still coming from Canada and the United States. A lot of their stuff is coming from other countries that at least the people believe is always going to be Russian. But by no means is it clear. It turns out also that only, just to add to the numbers, about half of the wheat is local. So this is the half that's imported. Okay, this what we're seeing here. These are the numbers. The half of wheat that's imported. Okay. Now about the
if half the wheat is not imported and it's locally grown and that's Yashan, so then you have overwhelming majority of.
So I'm not talking about. I'm sorry, I should have said this. I'm not talking about whether the din is that it should be mutter us. This is not a question of din. The question to say is it all Yashan without a question? No. You want to say is here's the reason why you should be mutter to eat it. Say called the parish. All kinds of things. Why you could think about the halachic shilas of Davishesh Matirin. We could do the shilah. The mutter us is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that the number the guy says. Well, if it went up by 1,000%, they're getting 10 times as much from there. Then, of course, they also said it was 70% local, which is not true. It's only 50% of the grain is local. But if you want to say it's mutter, that's fine. If you want to say it's not a shayla at all, then I'm questioning that's really true. Okay, now, the other thing that what they threw in as a sniff, they said is, hey, it takes 10 weeks for stuff to get back and forth. That's something that they're actually looking into more carefully now, because I don't know. I typed in the internet and said, okay, fine, who's a company that ships wheat from Canada, ships grains from Canada to Italy? And they said, you want a book? And I said, okay, show me which the ships that are going. Okay, so it takes, the ship takes 5.5 weeks to bring grain from Canada. This random company, I have no idea if that's normal or not, from this random company that I looked at, to ship a shipload of wheat from Canada to Italy takes 5.5 weeks. So the Yashan, so to speak, season for pasta from Canada is 7 months long, according to Yashan.com. From the middle of September to the middle of April for this year is going to be 7 months long. And it takes a certain amount of time to get the wheat from here to there, and then the pasta from there back to here. But so seemingly leaves us a bunch of months. It's not 10 weeks each way. It didn't seem like 10 weeks was correct. And it doesn't seem like, so it leaving plenty of time when the stuff could have gone all the way there and all the way back and still be a problem. Again, I'm not talking about if it's mutter asr. I'm just talking about the numbers pointed to the conclusion they were trying to reach. Okay, that's number two. Number third example. Okay, again, very different topic. Okay, there are lots and lots of people in the United States who keep kosher, and they're not Jewish. I shouldn't say they don't keep kosher. I take that back. They don't keep kosher. They buy food specifically because it has a symbol, kosher symbol on it, but they don't keep kosher. Okay, they couldn't care less about kosher, but they have a cultural reason or a health reason why they don't want dairy or they don't want meat or they don't want animal products. They have all kinds of reasons that draw them to say, oh, if this has a kosher symbol on it, then that makes me want to buy this product. They have nothing to do with keeping kosher. Okay, and it's those people are really drive a lot of the reason why companies get hashgacha, not only just the Jews, but also they're for sure the ones who are behind that reason why all kinds of non-food items and laundry detergent, that'll be our example. Laundry detergent has hashgacha. There aren't any people who keep kosher who said to the company, I will only buy your laundry detergent if it has hashgacha. Okay, no one came to that from a Kashrus perspective. But there are lots and lots of people who ask the companies that they should get hashgacha for their laundry detergent. Why? Because they don't want, let's say they don't want animal products. They don't care if the animal products is in their food or it's cleaning their shirts. They don't care. It makes a difference to them. So they push these companies to get hashgacha. Okay, so the company when people said to them, we want to make sure there's no animal products in your Tide laundry detergent, the company turned to their hashgacha and said, we know that people trust you to tell them that there's no animal products in it, so give us hashgacha so we can prove to people that we have no animal products in our thing. Okay, that's how it happened. So because that, the hashgachas turned around and said, okay, if we're giving hashgacha so that people will know that let's say there's no animal products and whatever would go into making something kosher, then we don't have to. They made a new set of rules of what it takes to be called something laundry grade kosher. Literally, that's what they call it. For non-food items. When we give hashgacha for non-food items, we make sure the ingredients are inherently kosher. We don't care whether there's blias of isser in them. Okay, we only have to make sure that, because the thing, who's buying this? Who's the one who cares if this non-food item is kosher? The one who cares about that is someone who cares about it is inherently kosher. They don't care about blias. So therefore, they only have to make sure that it's inherently kosher. You don't have to make sure that there are no blias in the thing. Okay, that's the general rule. Okay. Now, when they wanted to make glycerin that met this standard, okay, this lower standard, the way they told the OU's poskim was, they described to them what they were going to do and said, is this okay? And they said the company wants to make glycerin. And between the animal fat and the vegetable oil, they make the glycerin between one and the other, they're going to push through 100,000 pounds of water through the machine. Is that good enough to be, that what comes after that should be considered laundry grade kosher? Okay? So what's it?
Not that they're going to certify it, but they're going to allow
We're going to certify it as suitable for laundry grade. Suitable for non-food use.
What's the water got to
Yeah.
do with anything?
What?
What's the water got to do with anything?
There's water. They're gonna push water through the machine.
You mean there shouldn't be a mashal?
So there should be no residue left over. It should be. Will that be good enough for us to consider it that we got rid of all the animal fat from this thing, and now what comes afterwards, what's made afterwards, will be considered to be good enough to be counted not for food kosher, but for non-food use.
What's the law?
They just asked the rabbis, is this okay? Like, as Rabbi Shapter said, a Kosher Mishpah question. Are we being honest to people?
So make a swab test.
Okay, so
What does the machinery look like?
So the person said, no, they didn't say that. They said it's 100,000 pounds of water passing through a thing. Of course it's going to be, what could be left if you pass 100,000 pounds of water through something? Well, I mean, if there's something left, it ain't coming off tomorrow, okay? It's gone, okay? Well, the only problem is like this. The 100,000 pounds wasn't passing through a pipe that was like this big, okay? In your perception, you think 100,000 pounds passing through a pipe that's this big. So after all that water passes through, there can't be anything left after that, and whatever's left is never going to come off. Okay, well, it's actually not what happened. Really, this 100,000 pounds is in a machine called a splitter, which is about 4 feet wide and 110 feet tall. Okay. And where'd they come up with the number 100,000 pounds? Who came up with this magical number that it should be like that? That's because what? It's a very tall.
It's a vertical pipe.
It's not a pipe. It's called a splitter. Okay, it helps split the glycerin off the fatty acids. Okay, it's this huge thing, and they came up with 100,000 pounds because that's how much it holds. Okay, that's how much it holds. So they weren't going to pass through thousands and thousands of gallons through this little pipe and keep on washing it and washing it. No, they were going to just take one amount of water through was going to be pushed through the machine. The machine holds 100,000 pounds of water. After one pass through of that water will be considered clean. Now, we wouldn't think that. I wouldn't think that was clean after that. I wouldn't have imagined that. And guess what? Not only that, is that when they pass the water through, this is a nossens of a not also, okay? When you put in 100,000 pounds into 100,000 pounds, all the old water doesn't pass out before the new water comes in, right? You get a lot of left water. The cheshbon, about, I think, 60% of the water was still old water, was still going to be left behind. After you put in 100,000 pounds of new water, a lot of the old water was still going to be left behind. And there was other problems because this is only one of the pieces of equipment. There's lots of other equipment. Only this piece of equipment was going to have the water through. Okay, so whether the decision at the end was mutter or usher is not relevant to us. Okay, it was not relevant to me to tell you for today whether it was decided it should be mutter or it should be usher. Okay, but the point was is that when you hear this number, 100,000 pounds of water going through the machine is it going to be clean afterwards? And you say, oh, what's obvious? Like Levi said, what are you asking me a shiloh for? What do you come to ask me for? It's obvious. It's not going to be clean. Now imagine you try to clean a little pipe. But in fact, when you looked at when you saw it for real, that's not what was going on. It was by no means was it as simple or as straightforward as it sounded like at the beginning. Okay, now let's move to some other things. The next two, they're not exactly, but I call them a halachic bait and switch. Okay, and the first is like this. 2004, somebody realized that there were these small organisms called Copepods, in the New York City drinking water. Okay, so the question was, if there are these living things, or these things that used to be living things that are floating around in the water, then could you drink the water? Because you're not eating bugs. Okay, so there's a lot of parts of the shiloh, not relevant to us today, but two parts of the shiloh that are relevant to what we're going to say is first of all, are they visible? Meaning, because if they're only microscopic, then they're not usher. So are they visible? That's one question. And another question is, are they matsui? Okay, is it common enough to have these bugs in the water? Like if something happens like once in 1,000 years, you don't have to worry about it. Okay, there's a point, there's a cutoff. You say it's not common enough that I have to worry about it. Okay, so that was the second part of the question. So people who started working on this and understanding what was going on did two things. First of all, they came and they brought, now in the drinking water, the copepods are always dead. The chlorine kills them, so they're always dead in the drinking water. But they brought them live copepods, who are what they showed them, they brought like a vial with live copepods in them, and they were moving around, and they were quite large. Okay, they were very, very obviously visible. It was obvious to anybody that the thing you were looking at, it looked like a large piece of dandruff. But you never saw dandruff that was jumping around and alive and looked like this so much. But it was obviously there was something there. You could tell this was not water or anything regular. There was something going on over there. That was one thing, one piece of information. So is it big enough? They said, look, you can see how big this thing is. And the second thing is, they said, they made it a cheshbon. They calculated, based on their findings and this and that, they calculated that, what was the exact number they said? There was about be'erach one copepod in every cup of drinking water. Okay? So if there's one copepod in every cup of drinking water, that sounds mostly, that's common enough that you have to worry about it. Okay? Now, and then that now we move on to other parts of the shiloh is, yes, this is a bug that's big. Yes, it's a bug that's matzui. Imkain, is it mutter or usher? And not our shiloh for today, whether it's mutter or usher, not our problem. Okay, well, a weakness in this thing is that these two things that I just told you are really dependent one on the other. And that is like this. The bugs that were big and clearly visible are not one in every drinking cup. Okay? That is to say, those ones that are that big are not once in every drinking cup. That's the impression you get. This is how big they are. This is my statistics tells you how many are in each cup. Well, then you say, oh, if they're that big and they're one in every cup, then we have a problem. It turns out that the one in every cup was ones that were way, way smaller than that. Okay? The ones that are this are mamish very rare. It's very uncommon to find ones that were that big to be like that. So you can't.
The reason why they're smaller just because they're dead, or
they don't get smaller because they're dead. No, they're smaller because they're smaller. Because like there's small cats and big cats, So there's you found an example and say, look, you want to see how big they could be, and it's true. Those really are. They could be that big, but the ones that are so common are not that big. So if I say to you, they are this big, yes, it's also. They say, it's this common, okay, can I have a problem? Well, you're not looking at them together. You're looking at them separately, those two pieces. And you assume when you told me it's this big, and then you told me that it's this common, that they're the same thing, lav daf like that. Okay? So we're mixing two things together. We're taking a look at this and then look at this, but they're really not, you imply that they're the same, but they're really not the same. Okay? And now, secondary to this is not really so much to do with numbers, just a little to do. And that is, Rabelsky would say, not only in this case, he said is, well, let me say how he said it for this. He says, let's pause for a second and think. He says, you're telling me that it's matsui, that there are Copepods, 1 every cup of drinking water. He says the New York City water system has been around at that time for more than 100 years. There are millions of people drinking this water. How come nobody until 2004 ever saw one? You're telling me it's matzui, it's common, it's all over, it's common. It's common to see this thing. He says millions of people have been drinking this water, and no one ever saw it until this person in 2004, however he ended up finding it. So he says, wait. He says, so you have to realize. He says sometimes the logic and everything points you in one direction. This is a general thought, but logic points you in one direction. I'm sorry. All the steps point you, but when you get to the end, you say that conclusion is impossible. Okay. So his to say a conclusion that it's matzah to have bugs that are visible in the water when people have been drinking and never saw it, he didn't find that logical. So we have to find out where the mistake then is. But yes, what do you want to say?
You pointed out before that in the drinking water, it's going to obviously be much harder to see because they're dead.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason they were showing him things which are much more visible, are saying those are matzah.
Yeah.
But in a calamity, when it's in the drinking water, it's much harder to find because.
So, say that it's matzui, say that it's common to find that. You'd say so. Somebody would have noticed it
to be there. Even though it's really hard to find because they're tiny. They're tiny things once they're dead and they're not moving anymore.
Okay. He really said it's a general thing. He said in lots of cases. This was an example of where he said it, which is sometimes it has to do with numbers a little bit, but it has to do with in general. He says if you come to a conclusion that something, and then you look and you say that conclusion can't possibly be true. So now I have to think about all the steps I took to get there. I did 100 steps and they all led me in one direction, but I know it's not possible that could be true. Okay, let me go some more if you have patience.
So what was what did he feel?
I'm not telling. There was only one part of the shilah. Rebelsky, his main focus of the shilah was whether the bugs are usher or mutter in the first place. I'm just telling you from today we're talking about numbers. Just that the number points at you and says you a certain direction. You have to pause and think about whether that's true. Okay. The way other parts of the shilah, Rebelsky had lots to say about it. Had nothing to do with these numbers. Okay. I'm not talking. I'm just.
Shiur was about that.
What did you say?
One of the earliest.
Was about that? I don't remember. Okay, I'm totally focusing just on the numbers. Okay. Okay. Back to Yossi. The din is after we shech the cow, we need to check it for trephis. But we only check the Gemara. We only check for one kind of trephis in the lungs, and that's because trephis in the lungs are matzui. And since they're matzui, that's the one we have to check for. We don't have to check for other Medina Gemara. We don't check for other types of trephis because they're not matzui. The Rishonim explain because it's not matzui. Okay, it's not common that should happen. Okay, we work with an assumption that matzui means it's like 10%. So that tells us if we put these together, it tells us that out in the truth, about at least 10% of the animals are trephis. 10% of the animals are trephis. So if 10% of the animals are trephis, 10%. That's why we check the lungs to catch those. Let's say a problem in the brains or something else, we can make it a trephis. It's so rare we don't worry about that. But we know at least that a regular animal, 10% of the animals are going to be trephis. Okay, so as I told you beforehand, milk from an animal that's a trephis is not kosher. So when I go and I milk a cow and I get a cup of milk out of that, how do I know? Maybe the animal is a trephis. Maybe the milk I'm drinking is not kosher. So we say, call the parish. I assume that my cow is a kosher animal. My cow is a kosher cow. It's not the one that had a trephis. Okay, if I have no way to check, I'm not mechuyev to, and I say my animal is called the parish. If I have 5 cows, I also say my 5 cows are all the kosher ones. Okay, but that's all true when you have 1 cow or 2 cows or 5 cows. Okay, but what happens when I have a farm? Okay, it's got 1,000 cows. Okay, if you think about it, a small milk tank holds 6,000 gallons, so it holds enough milk from, let's say, 1,000 cows. Okay, so what's the chances that the milk they're in there are not enough cows? There wouldn't be 17 trephis. Why do you care if there are 17 trephis? Because there's 17 trephis, then the milk from those cows is not going to be botel b'shishim. Okay, what's the chances that there aren't 17 trephis in those 1,000 cows? Okay, so the answer is. Working with the number, there's 10% of cows are trephis. So what's the chances that of 1,000 we don't have 17 that are trephis? And the answer is 1 in 21 trillion. Okay, so if you wanted to know what that is, that's what the number is. Okay, I don't remember how many zeros are. Okay, but that's the chances that there are. So in other words, essentially, it's impossible that there aren't 17 trephis in those 1,000 cows. Okay, Okay, 1 in 20 quintillion means 0. Okay, see, woke him up. Okay, 20 quintillion woke him up. So the chances that there aren't. So we know. Okay, we know in those 1,000 cows that there's enough treifas in there to make it that this treif milk is not balta b'shishim. Okay,
Let's forget about the DAs.
right. There's no DAs. Right, forget about DAs. Forget just regular treifas, good old fashioned from Midin Hakamara. The animal, the milk that's in there, the treif milk is not balta b'shishim. Okay, so some people said so. Imkain, you can't take any dairy, eat any dairy products because the way modern farms work. Again, if you did it in your own farm, you're fine. You say, call the parish. I have a couple of cows. I'll say mine are all the kosher ones. I said, but if you have from a dairy farm, you can't do that, and you have to assume your milk is there's treif milk in that's not balta b'shishim. Okay,
They're making an assumption that we don't pass it's mutter before it goes into the vat.
that
That
mutter.
it's before it goes into the vat.
You're saying each cow. I should say each cow. It should be.
Milk a cow. before
Okay,
it
it's a
goes into the
fair.
vat.
Whether beforehand, but
It's a-
afterwards,
it's-
it's
It's a fair question.
beforehand, you don't know that it's straight. Now know it's
Once you
straight.
pass
Okay.
it's parish minarei.
Once you know, now you identify
Even
it.
in the
It's also
tank, it's
I mean, it's not a cash on us. The cash on the Ramah. The
Because
Ramah is mavur that even when you're ma'ar of a lot of cows.
so
That's
so
right.
one yes
The
one
The
of
same
the
yet hamatzah was true then.
no
It's only
the, the,
60 cows. That's all.
he only has
Exactly.
60 cows, but right, it's true. The Ramah's case of 60 cows is pretty bad.
You
Not
don't
20,
have
20,
25
20.
so you might have 3 or 4.
Yes,
2%
yes.
is a real
So
no,
who was the
it's
last
2%.
that
So I'm coming to that, Dov. Give me a
Called the
second.
parish.
Okay,
Each cow, the halacha is it's the right
So-
teva that this is mutter.
so guys, take it easy. Take it easy. Okay, so the answer is the reason why people disagree, as people are murmuring about, the reason why people disagree with the point we talk about only the numbers of it. The reason why people disagree, not because they disagree with the statistics, they disagree. They say it's like this: you're mixing two dinim together. Okay, you're taking a number and you're mixing two dinim. There's dinim of Bita Bashishim, there's din Mavita, Taima, Davar Maimid, all those kind of words in Hilchas Taruvas apply when we have Ruba Isa come on. When we have Isser that we know, we have known Isser and we have known Heter, and now we have rules of what do we do when we have Isser and Heter together. So we say the Isser is Bata Bashishim. It's not Bata if it's a barrier. There's all kinds of rules of what you do when you have an Isser, should be Bata or not be Bata. But that's only true when we have an Isser. But when we don't have Isser, we have statistically an assumption that there's an Isser. That's called the Rubik Lexicon. That's what we have here. We have 1 in 20 quintillion. We know that there's Isser, but no one saw one. It's not like at the farm, the Chol Yisrael farm, when we could see the cow, and on his tag, basically in his computer rack, on his tag, it says, I had surgery. Okay, I am a treifa. Okay, we can't see it. So then the rules are just Roiv, called the parish. There's a whole different set of rules. Okay, so the point here is that the numbers say to you, it's obvious that the milk that's in there is not bottle, and the answer is that's you took your statistic and you folded that into a din that doesn't connect to that.
Well, it doesn't connect. It's a 10%. We know bevade from Chazal, from the fact that we are noig to check. It means that we know bevade in the world. The stats are 10%.
Right. That's not. That's not we know. That's we know statistically.
Right.
That's right. It's different than that's not Hilchas Teruvas. That's Bata B'Roiv. That's the rule of Bata.
The statistics is telling us now a yediyah, anan tzadi, a yediyah bevadois. You can make a shvur deraisa. We know for bevadai that is less than the sherbittel of shreifus and lismol.
It's not.
It's not true. It's not true.
It is.
No. These statistics are not about What's the definition of
It's not
statistics?
true. It's denying reality. Reality is that one in...
I would never deny this reality, but it's not bevadai.
Of course it is. 1 in 20 quintillion is not bevadai. Not bevadai.
No,
Okay.
It's not bevadai about it.
it's not.
Do you guys have patience for some more cases? Because we're at a half an hour. Okay, I have more cases, but they're shorter.
If Moshe said you can drink challah stam because it's anan sadi, that it is Yisrael right. This is not anan sadi. The number is anan sadi. Of course
Yes.
it's anan sadi.
Okay. Let's go. Okay. I'll do a little more. We'll see how many I get through. I did 5 so far, but the next 5 are shorter than the first 5. Okay. What did you say?
It's a little interesting.
If they're interesting. Okay. So fine. Okay. The next bunch, the next 3 are what I call lost in translation. Okay, and that's like this. Okay, and that's like this. When we need to be mevatzali b'shishim, so we measure bittul in volume, the size of the isser or the heter, how much space it takes up. We don't measure bittul by weight, okay? And that means like this. The example is like this. If I'm going to show you now 4 of the exact same containers, okay? And if that same container was holding flour, that container was holding flour, it would weigh 5 pounds. If it was holding sugar, sugar is heavier, denser than flour, it would weigh 8 pounds. If it was holding lard, animal fat, it would weigh 9 pounds. And if it was holding glycerin, it would weigh 12.5 pounds. So if you were to get a recipe, most companies work in weight, by pound. They would tell you there's this many pounds of this and this many pounds of that. These would be listed as totally different from each other. Okay, the same container would have 8 pounds of sugar and 12.5 pounds of glycerin. But from the perspective of bittul works by volume. So from bittul side, these would all be exactly the same. Okay, these 4 containers would be all exactly the same thing. We wouldn't make a difference between one to the next. Okay, so if you look at the numbers, it would look like it is or is not bottle. Okay, at the weight numbers, look at the recipe from the company. It looks like it is or is not bottle. We use something called specific gravity. Specific gravity is this way of translating from weight to volume. Specific gravity gives 1 is considered water, and everything that's more dense than water gets a higher number, so it's 1.2, 1.3, how it relates to water. And things that are lighter, like flour, that's lighter than water, get less than this. It'll be 0.6 or 0.5 or like that. They're less dense than water. For every square inch, however it's worked, then it has less weight. Okay, so that's just a numbers thing where the numbers might look better or worse than the truth is. Okay, sort of connected to that is the Shiur challah. If you have a certain amount of flour in your recipe, you have to be mafresh challah. That shiur is also a volumetric shiur, and the shiur is either 43 1/5 eggs or 311 cubic etzbois. Okay, it's a volume shiur. It's a size. A container that's this big, this much flour is chayav in challah, and less than that is not chayav in challah. Okay, now for most people at home, also it's easier to make their recipes using weight instead of volume. So over the generations, literally for a long time, the Rambam, I know for sure has, and others along the way, in each country, they said, okay, the flour by us weighs this much, so it's this many pounds or drams or whatever quarts or whatever it is of flour, this measurement of the local weight of flour is how much you chayav in challah. Okay, so like from that perspective, a lot of people in America will tell you that if you have 2.5 pounds of flour, it's chayav in challah, and if it's 4.5 pounds of flour, it's chayav in challah with a bracha. Okay, because the shiur is not pounds, the shiur is space. But the housewife who's going to be making challah, or the baker, tell the bakery wants to make baking, he works with pounds, so we tell him a number in pounds. We translate the volume into weight. Okay, so being as the truth is that the shiur is a shiur in volume, so it's only the number that you're used to hearing is only a number in wheat flour. Okay, but when we get to other flours like spelt or rye, the shiur might not be the same, and it's most dramatic in oats. Okay, because oats are much lighter, and the shiur is way smaller. The shiur in pounds is much smaller. The shiur is exactly the same. There's no difference between the shiur and the other. The shiur is a certain amount of space. We make a container hold that much flour is what's chayav in challah. But in oats,
whole wheat versus
whole wheat is a whole different shilah, but whole wheat is very similar density-wise to regular flour. It has its own little shilah. It has a separate shilah to it.
Okay, when I count the
what?
When I count the shills.
Right, but as far as the flour itself, not all the flours are as dense one as the next, and in particular in oats, it comes out the most dramatically to be different. Okay, another one. I'm up to 8 already. I'm doing good. Okay, another one is. A lot of halachas depend on yad selet display. Like for example, if I have iser and heter that are both hot that touch each other, then tam transfers from one to the other. Okay, because they're both hot, and iser transfers from one to the other. Okay, we hold that when wine it reaches the temperature of yad selet display, it's considered mavushal, and if a guy would touch it, then it wouldn't become stam yain. Okay, so the Gemara describes yad selet display in 2 ways. Either that if you touch it, your hand would pull back from it. That's literally what the words mean. Yad selet, but your hand would like pull back from it. And the other one the Gemara says is, if you put it onto a baby's stomach, it would burn the stomach. Okay? So most people, again, don't want to work with that kind of a way of looking at it. So contemporary poskim try to put that into degrees. Okay, this many degrees Fahrenheit or Celsius. Okay, and they did that through the most ingenious ways. Literally, they found all kinds of places where the din talks about something being hot or cold, and then like it says the milk coming out of a cow is hot or cold. The base hashchita, the place where you shech the animal, is hot or cold. Okay, and then they measure the temperature of that thing that Chazal said was hot or was cold, or a person mentioned this thing is hot or cold, and they said, I could put my finger, I could say, that's the temperature, that's Yad Tzaleh Display, or that's not Yad Tzaleh Display, based on these kind of measurements. Okay, or literally all kinds of ingenious ways of how temperature could you cook an egg at? Okay, is either hot or cold, and then we can measure it and come up with a number that tells us Yad Tzaleh Display is this temperature or is that temperature. Okay, so that's all. We're all used to that. So Rabbi Tzvi Young pointed out that this whole exercise to turn Yad Tzaleh Display into a temperature is confusing heat and temperature. Temperature is a one-dimensional measurement that you do with a thermometer and tells you the temperature. Is it 40 degrees or 20 degrees? Okay, it tells you a measurement of something's temperature. Heat of something is very different from that. It includes two other things called specific heat capacity and thermal conductivity. And you could see this. We did this live by the Shiur when we talked about this. You can see this live if you go into your house, into a room that everything's been at the same temperature for 10 hours, and you take a piece of ice and you put it onto something metal, and you put a piece of ice onto a book. Okay, in our case, we did it onto that machine over there. Okay, and I brought a book in. Okay, and you put a piece of ice onto the metal, and you put a piece of ice onto the book, and you watch what happens. Okay, the ice will melt in seconds. The ice will be melting on the metal, but for a long time, the ice will just sit there on the book and not melt. They're both the same temperature. Okay, they're both the same temperature, but they have different specific heat capacity and thermal conductivity. You can listen to that Shiur or read about it in Sefer if you want to find out what those means.
Does that relate to insulation?
Does it relate
The insulation material.
Yeah, thermal conductivity relates to insulation.
Yes. Okay. So his point is that it's really questionable if we could use numbers based on measuring 10 different things when each one's got different factors. So the Yad Tzaleh Display we can't pick a number and say 120 degrees is Yad Tzaleh Display when seemingly it depends on what the material you're dealing with and not. It's not automatic.
Ear. So Rachel Fishman just told me he went into an oven, he walked into it, and it was 120 degrees, and he was like, "Wait, I could walk into this."
Right.
Yeah. So
right. Correct. Oh my God, Rebelsky talking about his schwitz. Okay, and you go into the schwitz and it's I think 140 degrees. I don't know whatever it is. Yes, it's a good question. So this question, I don't know the good answer to this question. You read about it.
No, there are friends that did it.
I know that. So his question is that seemingly I have to. It's true they did that, but it also would answer because if you dig in deeper, you find out that Achronim have all kinds of questions on each other. I have one raya. My raya says that it's this temperature. His raya says that it's that temperature. So what are you going to be? So you have 100 questions. And guess what? When you find out that the truth is one for one thing and the next thing is not the same. Okay, it's really a hanging question. You read about it if you want to. Okay, it's in Bitl and Bleed. Yeah, it's let's Bleed. Yeah. Okay.
What? Where is it?
The most recent Sefer. Bitl and Bleed. Okay. Two more. I'm sorry, we're late, but I'll finish. Okay, at least one more. Okay, there's like this. Most isurim are bought that get mixed into have to get balta b'shisha. Stam yayin is special that it gets balta b'shisha. Okay, even 6 times is enough to be invatled. Okay, and one case where people thought that should be true is that in Canada there's this rule that if you make Canadian whiskey and you export it to the United States, special rule, if you export it to the United States, it's allowed to have up to 9.09% wine in it. Okay, that's the rule. So, not bittul b'shisha is 16.6%, so 9.09 is good. So you say, okay, it's true there might be treif wine in there, but the wine that's in there is going to be bittul b'shisha, and I'm good and I can be able to drink the wine. Okay, that was a working assumption. Okay, it should be mutter. Is it wonderful? I don't know, but is it mutter? What?
The shisha is even min m'shein.
Specifically, mimish any mina. It's not balta b'shisha if it's wine into other wine. Right, wine into wine is not balta b'shisha. But over here, right. So there's 2 problems with this heter, so to speak. Well, this assumption. The first is like this: this 9.09% rule is measured in a really unusual way called alcohol by volume. Okay, so here's an example. Imagine if you had rye whiskey. 100, we'll call it, let's say liters or gallons, call it whatever you want, to 100 units of rye whiskey, wine, and water. What would you say that mixture is? You say it's a third rye, a third wine, a third water. Okay, I'm not talking about this balta b'shisha. How would you measure that? You would say it's a third, and a third. Okay, so it's a third of each one of them. Okay,
What is this, 100 pounds, 100 liters?
it doesn't make a difference. 100
They're all
liters.
the same.
100 units, 100 units, 100 liters, okay? So it's 100 liters. So a liter is a volume measurement, okay? So it's 100 liters of rye, 100 of wine, 100 of water. You would say it's a third, a third, and a third, okay? In your calculations, you would say it's a third and a third and a third, okay? But that's not how the government measures it, okay? They say how much alcohol is in each one of those. So the amount of alcohol is the rye whiskey is 60% alcohol, the wine is 15%, and the water is, of course, 0% alcohol. So the government said like this, well, if there's, we only measure alcohol by volume, that's what counts. So according to this cheshbon, it turns out that the rye, this mixture is considered to be 80% rye and only 20% wine, and 20% wine and 0% water. There is no water, according to the government, in this mixture because the water doesn't provide any alcohol. Okay, the wine presents is 15% alcohol, so it counts a certain amount. The rye whiskey is this amount. So this is the cheshbon. Okay. So you say exactly what? It's a government thing.
I didn't understand what they're saying.
We weigh each thing by how much. What?
There's water there.
Yeah, but what happens if there's
There could be more wine in it, but the wine doesn't count. Okay. Whether it's better or worse, I don't remember. But it's
the water.
Yeah,
So if you take out the water, you would have 20%.
now we have 20% wine instead of 15% wine. Okay, so
but then we started with 50. Your presumption was 50-50.
Okay, but what
If you
happens?
look at the water,
So
your
in
presumption was
so
50-50.
David in the example that I wrote in Sefer, the example was end up that the wine you would think is bottled, but it was not bottled. Okay, this is just a simpler example. Okay, it ended up you would think 9.9% it wouldn't be bottled. Truth it was, if I remember my number, it was 18%. Okay, I made it different. Okay, now so that's one quirk in the numbers. Okay, is that when they say 9%, 9.09%, they have their own special way of measuring this
What do the
thing.
people who are after this say back to that?
They say we made a mistake. I'm saying it's incorrect to think that just because 9% that doesn't mean it's mutter.
COR allows Canadian whiskey.
No, they don't. First,
they
they
don't
don't.
allow to certify it, but they allow it at events.
Certain ones. Now, wait a second. I'm not finished
That
yet.
was for experts.
Anyway, it's also only for export. The Canadian whiskey sold in Canada has its different rules. Okay, Canadian whiskey sold in United States has its own rules. Okay, now, but then there's another quirk to the rule, and that is the Canadian rule is when we measure this 9.09%, there's another quirk. It's not going to be on the screen. The other quirk is that anything that's as long as it has at least any liquid that has at least 0.5% wine is considered wine. Okay, so if you take a big thing of alcohol and you put in a little bit of wine into it, and now you say, this is my wine, then that's considered wine. So the din would say is, that's not wine, that's only 0.5% wine. Okay, actually, it might even be totally mutter to drink that thing, because it's only 0.5%, it's bottled bashisha. But from the Canadian law, that's considered wine. If you want to put in more alcohol into your beverage, more cheap alcohol into your beverage, you put a little wine into this alcohol first, and then when you mix it in, you say, I'm not mixing in alcohol. I'm not mixing in alcohol. I'm mixing in wine. Oh, wine, you're allowed to put in up to this percent, up to 9.09%, and it doesn't count. You're allowed to put that in. But really, you're putting in alcohol. Okay? But so it's considered, you're legally considered to have, let's say, 8% wine. But that 8% wine, how much stam yayin does it have in it? Is that almost none. Okay? So that's a cooler to say is that what they call wine might not even be wine in the first place. Okay, so I'm saying here we are. Here's the translation. The government's measurement of wine and our measurement of wine are not the same thing. Okay, one l'chomra, one l'kula. Okay, one way we could have more wine than they think. One we could have less wine than we think. Okay,
Is that like the light grape juice has a higher water content?
it's a simple idea. I guess it could be something. Okay, my last thing, and this will be short. I'm really over time. I'm sorry, everybody. And that is like this. When we calculate bittul bashisha for stam yayin, that works. The logic of that is that when it's so diluted, then it doesn't have the character of wine. It doesn't taste like wine anymore, or it might taste like wine. It doesn't have the same chashivas of wine. Not as wonderful as wine. It might taste a little bit like wine, but it's like a wine-flavored beverage instead of being wine-ish, and therefore it doesn't have the din of wine either. Okay, since it doesn't have the look of wine, it doesn't have the din of wine either. Okay, so imkain, if you have grape juice concentrate, you have grape juice concentrate, then it doesn't help to just put in 6 times as much water as there is concentrate, because most of that water is just going to go back to making it into regular wine. We have to get it diluted to the point that it doesn't seem like wine anymore. If all the water we're adding in is just making it back to wine itself, we haven't done the trick yet. Okay.
Brown says it's the most potent items. That's what we need shishim.
No, that's shishim. That's a different thing. So that's shisha. By first of all, by there we have the same kind of a din. Where if something is avila taima, it also won't be bought to shishim.
It's avila taima.
Right, but shisha, it's the same kind of idea, which is that shisha is to say this is not like wine-ish anymore, and therefore it doesn't have the din of wine either.
No.
Well, if we just put the water back in to make it back to itself, then it's not going to be wine either. Then that's awesome. Okay. Now, but another example of that. So for example, if we kasher after concentrated grape juice, okay, and we say I have 6 times as much water as we had isser, well, you have to have 6 times as much as the reconstituted grape juice, which might be 30, 40 times, rather than 6 times as much times the actual grape juice that was in it. Okay, and another example of that is has to do with one of the shilas about drinking scotch made in sherry casks is whether the blias of sherry are bata b'shisha. Okay, that's one of the questions, one of the many questions that there are relating to that. And in that, you have to bear in mind that sherry is not just a brand name of wine. Sherry is fortified wine. Okay, sherry is wine that has brandy mixed into it. Brandy is concentrated wine. So when you're making the cheshbon is a bata b'shisha, it's not just is it bata b'shisha physically, literally 1 gallon to 6 gallons. It's that the sherry is actually worth, so to speak, worth more than itself. Okay, so it's really it itself is a concentrated wine. So then, if you want to make that cheshbon say it's bata b'shisha, you need more than 6 times, physically 6 times. You have to imagine it being reconstituted or to single strength, and then being bata b'shisha.